Firstly, is it right that you've been a Member of Parliament for Eglinton Lawrence since 2015?
That is correct.
And from the 26th of October 2021 to the 26th of July 2023, you served as the Minister of Public Safety, is that right?
That is also correct.
And before that, you served as the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship from 2019 to 2021.
That is true.
My questions today will relate to your time in office as the Minister for Public Safety. And with that in mind, to begin your evidence, please would you provide us with a brief overview of your role and responsibilities as the Minister of Public Safety?
Well, in short, my job as Minister of Public Safety was to ensure the safety and security of the Canadian people and the Canadian national interest. And that took on many different roles. I was given a mandate letter from the Prime Minister, as he does when swearing in a new cabinet. There were a number of priorities that I was charged with seeing to manifestation, including in the area of foreign interference, which I know we're going to be discussing with at length. One concrete example of my mandate was to take what we described at the time as the HASA strategy and to translate that into legislation, which is now Bill C-70. There were many other priorities that I was taking on at the time outside of the scope of foreign interference, but certainly that was a top priority.
Thank you. I'm going to focus now on the flow of information between the department and your office. First, I want to discuss the way in which information was shared between the department and your office during your time as Minister for Public Safety. Over the course of yesterday and Tuesday, we heard evidence from Rob Stewart and Dominic Rashan that during Mr Blair's tenure as Public Safety Minister, around twice a week, they would receive binders containing intelligence products of interest and relevance to the department, and in turn, they would provide them to the Minister's office. Similar binders, having been provided to the Minister's office, would eventually make their way to the Minister. They said this practice of providing binders continued throughout the pandemic. We then heard yesterday from Zita Astravez, who was the former Chief of Staff for Mr Blair, and as far as she was concerned, that practice of providing binders did not continue during the pandemic, and in effect, she said, the Ministerial Office stopped receiving those binders. Ms Astravez also told this inquiry that when you first took up your office in October 2021, she provided transitionary support, and at that time she raised the binders with you and she advised you to resume or reinstate them, having explained that they were no longer being received. My question is this: when you took up office, did Ms Astravez raise the need to reinstate the binders with you? And if so, what was the nature of that discussion?
Yes, Ms. Astravez did do that, and she made it clear to me that it was important that I receive routine intelligence briefings, both in written as well as in verbal fashion. And but before I expand a little bit on how I made sure that we adhere to that advice during the tenure of my time as Minister of Public Safety, let me just zoom out briefly to talk about how, in practical terms, I fulfilled that role. It is imperative that the minister be given access to intelligence. And the reason for that is that there are certain ministerial authorities that only the Minister of Public Safety can exercise. For example, the approval of CSIS warrants. So in order to be able to discharge that responsibility, a minister has to be able to have robust access to intelligence. I would say that built on that advice, and with my chief of staff and all of the staff that worked in my office, as well as my deputy minister, the deputy ministers who worked for me during my tenure, I made sure that I was getting frequent access. Now, there are a few areas which I think can serve as a boilerplate to further improve the flow of information going forward, and I want to offer a few examples for the benefit of the Commission. One I've already mentioned, and that is CSIS warrants. So I would receive both copy of the warrant which included the supporting affidavit, so that I could review the information and the intelligence to ensure that all the legal requirements were met under the law, along with a covering note. And that covering note would be authored by my deputy minister or come under his or her signature, along with any other recommendations vis-a-vis the approval of the warrant. The second example that I would offer would be in the form of the national security review process for transactions under the Investment Canada Act. There was what I would call in the vernacular that I would use good paper to support those recommendations. In other words, access to intelligence reports from the public safety and intelligence community, followed by a recommendation as to whether or not we should or should not approve the transaction, depending on whether it could be injurious to our national security. And then the third and final example that I would offer were the approvals of threat reduction measures. Now, these were new powers that were recently passed into law in 2019 under Bill C-59. And the purpose of threat reduction measures was to give primarily CSIS, but other actors in this space, the ability to reduce threats to our national security and to the Canadian national interest, enabling them to go out into the fields, having conversations with people who may be targets so that we could, again, mitigate those threats. There, too, as you will have seen, and those documents have been provided as exhibits to this commission, there was good paper, good information flow. I think that the challenge now is for us to take those as boilerplates or as templates and to apply it to other areas, including when it comes to foreign interference.
Thank you. Sticking with the topic of your powers and authorities as a minister and thinking about warrants and the other measures that you've just referenced, I have a few questions. Court operator, could you put up WIT 147, please, and go to page 9? Paragraph 35. Thank you. Mr. Mendicino, here you talk about wearing two hats as a minister for public safety, the political and the official role. And in the exercise of the ministerial powers that you've just talked about, you also discuss whether you can improve the distinction between the two. And would you agree that in circumstances where that power might need to be exercised against political opponents or even a member of your own party, there exists a potential for bias or apparent bias?
In addition to those two concerns, also an abuse of power. And so I do think that we have to be vigilant against those types of abuses. And in paragraph 35, I make reference to what is known as the Shawcross Doctrine. This is a doctrine that explains the different functions that are occupied by the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice, typically in the Canadian democracy in one person, and understanding that the role of the Minister of Justice is a political one within the cabinet to provide advice to the government, but also the concurrent role of the Attorney General, which is a quasi-judicial function that, of course, supersedes any partisan role and is there to protect our democracy. And so I do believe that there are principles that could be applied to the Minister of Public Safety, particularly now as we have seen the threat of foreign interference become more pervasive, more insidious, and that poses a threat in virtually every facet of our life. We're talking a lot about our democracy and our elections and the parliamentarians and the officials that work within that space, but I am equally concerned about the threats to our critical infrastructure. I am equally concerned about the threats to our economy. I am equally concerned about the threats to our academia. And I am especially concerned about the threats to diaspora communities in the form of transnational repression, which I know the Commission has heard evidence about.
Thank you. You've talked about the Shawcross principle. I'm thinking more practically about the mechanics of how decisions are made. Do you have any views on whether there could be improvements in that respect?
Well, I would start with the principle that it's important to distinguish the functions within government. So as an elected member of Parliament and as a former minister, there are certain functions that only the Minister of Public Safety can authorize. And I've already made reference to one in the form of the CSIS warrant. But it's not as though the minister takes that decision on his or her own. It has to be supported by the advice and the recommendations of the unelected, impartial, neutral, professional public service. And this is where I think we cut to the core of it with the Shawcross Doctrine. It is imperative that we not repose all these decisions in the elected branch. It is imperative that we rely and defer in many cases to the advice of the professional public servants who are not elected, who are not partisan, to check against the risk of those abuses that I described earlier. And so that decision that is taken by the Minister of Public Safety is based on the advice that we get from the public service in CSIS and other members within the public safety community and the intelligence community.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to information flow more generally. You've already touched upon it, but I'd like to just explore that in a little bit more detail. During your tenure as Minister for Public Safety, could you just give us a description of what your daily visibility was like in relation to foreign interference matters?
I was routinely briefed on it. Those briefings came in both verbal and written form. In many and most instances, vis-a-vis foreign interference, those briefings had to take place in a secure environment, or what we often refer to as the bunker. I spent many hours in the bunker being briefed on sensitive matters, and then taking those decisions that are necessary in that environment.
And when you took office, did you implement any changes to the way in which intelligence came in and out of your office?
I did. First, insisting that I receive frequent briefings on intelligence that related to any threats to our national security. Second, as I mentioned, I authorized threat reduction measures specifically for parliamentarians who had become the target of foreign interference by our adversaries. Third, I issued a ministerial directive to strengthen the flow of intelligence and information to the elected branch of government by requiring that any threats targeting parliamentarians had to be briefed directly to me. And I'll take a moment to explain that the issuing of the ministerial directive came in the wake of a series of unauthorized disclosures of intelligence to the media involving especially Michael Chong. And the great concern that I have, obviously, for his and all of my colleagues' safety in the chamber led me to take the decision that it was important to issue that ministerial directive to further clarify my expectation that as the Minister of Public Safety that I would be directly briefed. And I know that the Commission has heard a lot of evidence already about how information flows and all of that, and I'm happy to expand on how I think some of those decisions improve the flow of information, and I readily accept that there's still more work to be done.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to the counter-HASA strategy, and just to say that we've already heard a lot about the strategy, and so my questions are going to be focused on some specific aspects of it and the timeline for its development. Court Operator, could we please put up CAN 11948? This is a timeline relating to the HASA file, and on page 1 we can see that from around September 2018, Public Safety had begun developing the HASA strategy and an engagement and strategic communications policy paper. And if we can go to page 2, please, and go to the bottom of the page if you can, thank you. There we can see the timeline runs to October 2019, and if we turn to page 3, as of October 2019, this page indicates that there are various steps that are still left to be carried out. Court operator, can we now put up CAN 3249? The HASA strategy that we just talked about, having been developed around September 2018, is reflected in this document. Have you had an opportunity to review this document, Mr. Mendicino?
Yes.
And does that accord with your recollection of what the draft strategy was like by the time you took office?
Yes, and if I could just be permitted briefly to provide some additional context about what was already in place when I took the chair as Minister of Public Safety, because I know you've heard about our plan to protect our democracy, and that was a plan whose inception dated back to 2018. Part of that plan was to put in place the critical incident election protocol. This is a protocol to ensure that we were better protecting our elections. There was the site panel that was created of, again, senior unelected public servants to ensure that that protocol was being applied appropriately, and also to educate the public about any potential threats to our elections. There was the passage of Bill C-76 into law, which made it illegal for any foreign financing as a way to prevent or mitigate against any threats around foreign interference and funding in our elections. And then my predecessor, Minister Bill Blair, had issued a letter to parliamentarians to make sure that everyone was eyes wide open about the rapidly evolving nature of foreign interference, to make sure that they were alive to the risks that they were targets of our adversaries. So all of that was in place already when I took the chair as Minister of Public Safety, and I was assured that we were well on our way. The work that I had to do, in addition to improving some of the information and intelligence flow, was to take that HASA strategy, which included various components, including intelligence priorities and assessments of countries and the types of ways in which they would deploy foreign interference to attack our democracy, to take that HASA strategy and to turn it into something tangible in the form of legislation.
Thank you. Court operator, could you put up COM sum 4, please? And could you zoom out so we can see more of the page? You said your aim was to develop something tangible. This is a summary of a memorandum to Cabinet entitled Modernising Canada's Approach to Addressing Threats from Hostile Activities by State Actors. Is that what you mean by developing something tangible, turning it into a memorandum to Cabinet so that decisions can be made about how the government moves forward?
Yes, and just to be clear about what came of that exercise, there's a lot of work that goes into the creation of an MC or a memo to Cabinet. And the strategy was the foundation for that. The strategy that talked about 3 pillars: strengthening, detecting, and acting. And strengthening was about hardening Canada as a target, critical infrastructure, our cyberspace, our institutions. Detecting was really about improving our ability to surveil the threats of foreign interference to Canada, and acting, which was to deploy enforcement where and whenever we could, both with members of the intelligence community as well as with law enforcement. And we can elaborate on that through the course of my evidence, but it was to take that strategy and then put it into the form of legislative proposals. I'm quite pleased to see that once we were able to take that MC to Cabinet and get it ratified in the spring of 22 or thereabouts, a number of months shortly after I took the chair as public safety, it has now become law. And what that means is that there is a greater capacity for CSIS to share information. It means that there are procedures in place to declassify information so we can approach parliamentarians, so we can shine a light on the threat of foreign interference and be more transparent with them, including with the creation of NSIRA and NCCOP. It means that there are new laws in place which we can use to prosecute those who are committing foreign interference at the direction of or in association with our adversaries. And finally, it has created a foreign influence and transparency accountability regime, which is commonly referred to as a foreign agent registry. All of that was the work that we had to do in cabinet to build consensus within the government, and then after that to then make it legislation.
Thank you. Court operator, could you go to page 2 of this document? And just for clarification, Mr. Mendicino, the MC, as we see there, sought to implement various elements, including the endorsement of the principles and the pillars that have been set out in the HASA strategy, as you've just mentioned, to implement a whole of government strategic communications approach, and as you've also just mentioned, to explore legislative enhancements, which, as we know, became Bill C-70. And so for ease, I'm just going to put these 3 elements into 2 categories: the strategy category and the legislative category. And firstly, in relation to the legislative category, you were eager, you say in your statement, to see the HASA MC materialise in a concrete way. And as you've already said, we now know that that bill has become law earlier this year.
I was very eager.
And secondly, in relation to the strategy element, you again say in your witness summaries that you were eager or very eager to see those progress. And by the time you left office in July 2023, a draft version of the HASA strategy was in existence, but no version of the communication strategy existed at that time. In your interview, you also said that pushing forward with both the legislative and the strategy elements were not without challenges. And court operator, if we can put up CAN 18005, I just want to explore with you what some of those challenges might have been. If you could go to page 2, please. This is a text message exchange with Brian Clough, who at the time I understand was the Prime Minister's Deputy Chief of Staff, and it's in November of 2022, so the same year that the HASA MC had been before Cabinet. And this message principally concerns overseas police stations. But within the conversation, you say, I really need your help on pushing ahead with the policy investments, which has been very hard for a variety of reasons. And court operator, can we now put up CAN 45922? And if you could scroll down so we can see as much of the body of the email as possible. Thank you. This is an email within public safety, and it's dated August 2023, so after you've left office, Mr. Mendicino. But it speaks about an update on the HASA strategy, which by then has become known as the Foreign Interference Strategy. And we can see that the writer highlights that the strategy has met resistance, and thus far the timing has not been right. And so I'm going to ask you to address 2 points. Can you first of all tell us what work was being undertaken between May 2022 and July 2023, in particular in respect aspect of the strategy, because we know that the bill did come to fruition, but please do add details in relation to the bill as well. And then the second point is, can you tell us what the challenges were in progressing both the legislation and the strategy, and what you did to overcome those challenges?
I can, but just to clarify, I am not able to speak to the second document that is currently on the screen, since I am not party to it, and it postdates my time as Minister of Public Safety. But I certainly can speak to the first document which you put up, which is a text exchange between myself and Mr. Clow, who works for the Prime Minister. But to answer your question, the work that was being undertaken between the time at which I got my MC ratified at Cabinet and the time that I concluded my time as Public Safety Minister, was developing a consensus around how to, one, take that MC and turn it into drafted legislation, which is a highly complicated, nuanced, precise drafting exercise, which is undertaken by policy experts and lawyers within the Department of Justice, Ministry of Public Safety, and the community of public servants that do that work. Second, it involves coming up with a sound communications strategy, and given how emotionally charged this subject is, it was very important that we get the legislation off on the right foot. Third, as part of that, we had to consult the public. And that is work that I did lead as Minister of Public Safety, primarily on the creation of the Foreign Agent Registry, or what is now known as FITA for short. And that consultation was conducted both by myself, personally, reaching out to Canadians, hearing from them about their concerns around potentially being stigmatized or stereotyped, as well as potential overreach around the creation of this legislation. And I do think that we have taken some lessons in the past, that if we draft legislation too quickly, and if we don't get that legislation right, that there can be overreach. So consultation was work that we were doing. And then all of that was against the backdrop of other events. And, Your Honor, let me just pause for a moment to say that when I took the chair, as you heard me say earlier, I was very eager to see the HASA strategy become law. And in order to do that, we first had to get this MC to Cabinet, build consensus, get it ratified. I would say that even though I wanted to make sure that the HASA MC was charging ahead full steam, that we were running into a Category 5 hurricane of events beyond our control. And those events were COVID-19, the Freedom Convoy, the invocation of the Emergencies Act, the Russian invasion into Ukraine, all of the work that went into the review of the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act in the form of the Rouleau Commission, the exhortation of our allies for Canada to become part of the effort to stabilize the situation in Haiti, and obviously the unauthorized disclosures around foreign interference, which were another complicating factor. So this was, and I know we throw around this term quite casually, but an unprecedented time in government. And I would say that in spite of all those challenges, but the fact that we were able to get that MC to Cabinet ratified in mere months, and then proceed with the steps that were necessary to turn that MC into legislation was not easy, but I am very pleased that it is now law.
Thank you. Court operator, could you please put up WIT 105? I want to turn back for a moment to the registry and the consultation, which I understand you spearheaded. Court operator, could you take us to page 12, paragraph 51, please? And if you could take consultations with diaspora communities to the top of the page. Thank you. I understand that during the course of the consultations, you heard concerns that the registry might further stigmatise members of the diaspora community. and in the What We Heard report, and I can put it up if it helps Mr. Menachino, the concerns of a similar nature were also reflected, that the registry could stoke racial or ethnic exclusion or be used to blacklist communities. Can you expand on those concerns and explain how they were addressed as part of the development of Bill C-70?
I can. And during the course of public consultations, I did hear a lot of feedback from those communities as well as others about the concerns around stigmatization. Bear in mind at the time, we were still in the throes of the pandemic or starting to come out of it, but not through it. And I do recall there being many incidents of anti-Asian racism, and the intersection between that phenomenon and the concern about a potential abuse or overreach in the creation of a foreign agent registry was something that I heard a lot of feedback about. Our response was in part to take the time that was necessary to weave that feedback into the drafting of the legislation. And again, we can expand on it, but one of the things that we contemplated very carefully was taking a country-agnostic approach in the drafting of the foreign influence, transparency, and accountability regime as a way to mitigate against the concerns around stigmatization from particular parts of the world.
Thank you. And it's right that the consultation was also extended to sub-national governments. Could you tell us some more about that?
Yes. So by way of example, in my time as Minister of Public Safety, there was an incident involving the so-called Chinese balloons. And that required conversations with other levels of government. And it seems to me that this is another one of those areas where we really do need to give careful thought about how we share information that is classified with stakeholders that are outside of the federal government, including premiers of the provinces and territories. And in my view, I think C-70 addresses that with procedures in place to both declassify information, but equally to authorize CSIS and other intelligence officials to go out and share information outside of the four corners of the federal government, including with sub-national governments. I do think that there is scope as well to consider using forums like what we call the FPTs, the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Forums, as a place in which we can further strengthen the lines of communication in the intelligence space and potentially moving into secured environments where necessary, making sure that individuals are properly cleared, et cetera, and vetted. But certainly subnational cooperation is imperative because foreign interference doesn't just go after federal levels of government. It also can be and is a problem for provincial and territorial governments as well as municipal governments.
Thank you. I now want to turn to threats to parliamentarians. You've already touched upon this, so I'm not going to ask you to repeat what you've said in relation to how the ministerial direction came about. But court operator, can we please put up CAN 21931? This is the ministerial direction that was issued by you. And court operator, if you can scroll down, please, so that we can see the numbered paragraphs. Thank you. Paragraph 1 states that CSIS will investigate all threats. Paragraph 2 includes that when CSIS assesses there to be a threat to the security of Canada directed at Parliament or a parliamentarian, it will pursue the appropriate lawful methods in response. And paragraph 4 states that the Minister of Public Safety will be informed of all instances of threats to the security of Canada, again directed at Parliament or parliamentarians. This document didn't set any threshold or parameters for what constitutes a threat. Can you explain what you envisaged as meeting the threshold when you put this together?
I envisaged a broad and flexible interpretation of threats to parliamentarians, and I was intentional about that. And the reason is that in the aftermath of the unauthorized disclosures to the media about potential threats to Michael Chong, there were many serious questions, entirely legitimate questions asked about the flow of intelligence. And so my response to remedy that situation was to be clear in the language of the ministerial directive, my expectation that I be briefed on threats to the security of Canada directed at Parliament and parliamentarians. I would also say that prior to this ministerial directive, there was another ministerial directive that provided general direction to CSIS on when and how they should brief the minister on a particular situation or matter, depending on the legality, the complexity, the potential jeopardy that the government might face as a result of those threats. And this was building on that ministerial directive with further clarity and precision around the category of foreign interference and parliamentarians. So what I envisaged was a broad and flexible interpretation of threats to parliamentarians.
And then you were relying on CSIS to determine when you should be informed of a given threat.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
We've also heard that subsequently, and after you'd left office, a protocol was developed for the implementation of the direction. And one of the concerns that led to the development of that protocol was when the threshold of a threat had been met for the purposes of CSIS triggering the direction. That resulted in a focus on the word credible threat within the protocol. And my question to you is, do you agree that credible threat is the appropriate threshold to apply?
I certainly am sympathetic to the amount and the volume of intelligence that has to be sifted through. And I think looking at language like credible, actionable, other principles that come to mind, and I'm now going back to my previous life as a federal prosecutor, credible, corroborated, and compelling. Those are the types of principles that I think can help lead to a recommendation as to whether or not specific intelligence is actionable. I believe that that is a parallel conversation to the real objective of this ministerial directive. There are decision points, which again, only the minister can take, but the real purpose and the vision of this ministerial directive was to ensure that the minister was directly briefed on threats to parliamentarians so as not to be caught flat-footed in the event of an unauthorized disclosure, because there are legitimate questions as to the flow of information where that does not happen. And so this was an effort to remedy that situation. Now, over time, I do believe that we have to continually have a conversation about the flexibility and the breadth of that threshold. And your insertion of the protocol after my time, using words like credible, but there are some other words that I've suggested there, can I think further refine that. But I wanted to err on the side of inclusion so that the elected side of government could remain kept very much alive to threats to parliamentarians, because ultimately we are accountable. And in order to maintain the confidence of Canadians, we have to adhere to that principle. And this was an effort to achieve that goal.
Thank you. I'm now going to move on to the issue of overseas police stations. Again, you've touched upon it, but I'd like to just explore it in a little bit more detail. Court operator, could we put up WIT 105, please? And if we can go to page 8, paragraphs 32 to 36. You previously talked about your involvement in this issue, but for today's purposes, could you briefly tell us when you first became aware of the presence of overseas police stations and what steps were taken during your time in office to address this issue?
Well, as it says at paragraph 33, I was briefed in late 2022 or early 2023 about the phenomenon of these so-called overseas police stations. I was briefed about a report that was authored by an international NGO that painted a very stark picture about the proliferation of overseas police stations, not only in Canada, I would hasten to add, but all around the world. I do recall after or in the course of being briefed that CSIS had issued an alert about OPSs and that the RCMP had taken some decisive action to disrupt any foreign interference which could have been deployed through OPSs by placing marked cars at some of the locations where they had good reason to believe that foreign interference may be occurring. And I had also been briefed that from my officials that the foreign interference related activities to these OPSs had been shut down at the time, and those briefings then also took the form of subsequent briefings given by the RCMP.
Thank you. Court operator, could you scroll down to paragraph 34, please? Mr. Montalcino, here you explain that you met with members of the communities that had been affected by the alleged police stations to learn more about the issues and hear their concerns. Earlier in our hearings, we heard from panelists who described these stations in a different way. They were described as community centres that provided support for newcomers that would help them integrate into Canadian life. And in particular, Ms. Wawa Lee described that she referred to an irresponsible public announcement that a Montreal centre was alleged to have been operating as an illegal Chinese police station, and that led to loss of funding and an impact on a number of community resources and support that was otherwise being provided. You also explained in your statement that when you heard concerns, they were not unanimous. Can you expand on the concerns that you heard? And at the time that you were having these conversations, were you aware of the views that had been expressed by Ms. Lee during these hearings?
I was generally aware, and I was also aware that there was not unanimity within the community about whether or not what was going on at overseas police stations was, in fact, according to them, foreign interference. I had been briefed otherwise, and that's why the enforcement steps were taken, and that is why the intelligence community had issued an alert, and all of that was on the strength of a report that had been independently authored by a non-governmental organization. So I was aware of the fact that this phenomenon, this particular example of foreign interference, was the subject matter of intense debate. I would just hasten to add that, again, this is why it is important that we charge our experts in the public service to sift through this intelligence and to advise the government about what, if any, steps can and should be taken to reduce a threat to our national security. And C-70 does add to the toolbox. It does create new offenses where, in a situation where there was foreign interference at an overseas police station, as they are described, that they potentially could go from the intelligence world into the evidentiary world and potentially be used in a prosecution. And this is an area where I have some experience as a former prosecutor, deploying the intelligence to evidence protocols that are in place with the use of things like what were then called advisory letters, which are now called use letters, where CSIS provides intelligence to the law enforcement branch and then takes that evidence and turns it into admissible evidence. There are protocols that can be used to mitigate against the type of threats that were reported at OPS.
To what extent, if any, do you think that Ms. Lee's concerns have been or should be addressed?
Well, again, here, I think it's important that we defer to the intelligence and the law enforcement community, and I believe that you've heard evidence that these investigations are ongoing. And so I want to be careful and prudent about coming to judgment about any particular incident involving or allegation involving overseas police stations. But to my mind, this is further proof about the pervasiveness and the rapidly evolving nature of foreign interference, that our adversaries are looking for vulnerabilities within the community. And the theory around this particular example of foreign interference is that these were satellites that were being used to practice transnational repression for those who were speaking against our adversaries, and that through these satellites, they could intimidate, threaten, harass, or otherwise make life uncomfortable for Canadians. And that is fundamentally wrong. And we need to be sure that we are equipping ourselves with the tools that are necessary to protect against that. All of the work that I had done in my time as Minister of Public Safety around taking the HASA strategy, turning it into a memo to Cabinet, and then consulting the public, including, as you saw in the What We Heard report, was with a view to achieving that goal.
Thank you. Court operator, could you now put up WIT 147? And could you go to paragraph 34? Thank you. I want to ask you about nomination contests. In your examination summary, you agreed that nomination contests were a potential vector for foreign interference, and there's a vulnerability there. However, you also cautioned against federal regulation of those contests, citing the risk of delineating where the partisan lines and the government authority begins. Can you expand on your concerns around regulation, and do you have any views on an alternative means of addressing the vulnerability?
I do. And first, let me say by way of background, and having gone through a very contentious nominations, that they are a healthy part of our democracy. And so we should be sure to protect that as an element of our democracy. That said, political parties are charged with the responsibility of coming up with important rules around who is eligible to participate in a nomination process, including who the candidates are, who the members are. They are charged with the responsibility to do proper vetting of those candidates before, as we like to say in the business, green lighting them, approving them to run. And I believe that the work of the Commission can be very instructive and helpful to parties about how they can be more vigilant in their due diligence around the screening of candidates, around the rules around their eligibility, but as much as possible, respecting the independence and the autonomy of the political parties themselves to come up with those rules. That does not mean that their work should be done in segregation of all of the other work that is being done by the government to mitigate against the threats of foreign interference. And so I believe that a party that is acting prudently should be seeking out advice from the professional public service, particularly in the intelligence community, about potential threats involving foreign interference. So seeking protective briefings, as CSIS has done, by the way, providing, in my time, I think, just shy of 50 briefings to parliamentarians, but they could take that model and apply it, maybe expand on it for the benefit of political parties. I believe the site panel might be another appropriate forum who is already charged with the responsibility of safeguarding our elections to be a place in which parties can receive voluntary protective briefings so that they are, again, eyes wide open, soberly aware of where the threat vectors may be in the nomination process. There may also be some additional legislative work, Your Honor, that you may wish to examine, but my only caution is that we have to be prudent before the government of the day writes any laws which could influence the outcome of a political party in a way which may be perceived as a tactical advantage to the incumbent government. And I think this gets back to that theme that we were talking about around understanding the division of function between what the elected government is there to do and what the unelected, professional, nonpartisan government is there to do. And I think that where there is work to be done is further scoping out the relationship between political parties and how they get briefed on potential threats of foreign interference as they undertake nomination and other internal exercises that lead up to the general election or a by-election.
Thank you. I'm now going to move on to a subject of collaboration with partners outside of federal government. Court operator, could you put up CAN 22697? And if you could scroll down, this, Mr. Mendicino, is a transcript of an interview that you gave to the Centre for International Governance Innovation in June 2022. And I can take you to the relevant parts if necessary, but in this interview, you underscore the need for government to be more outward-facing and that combating misinformation and disinformation requires working closely with the private sector, academia, and industry leaders. And the Commission has already heard lots of evidence on this, but what I want to ask you about is what work was being done by public safety in relation to that during your time in office. Did your office take any steps to create or cultivate non-governmental partnerships during your tenure?
They did a ton of work, and I'm quite proud of it. One other important initiative that I oversaw in my time as Minister of Public Safety was the creation of a HASA, what was then called a HASA coordinator, what is now called, I believe, the National Counter Foreign Interference Coordinator. And this is a quarterbacking role within public safety to bring together all of the different branches within the public safety and intelligence community, including building these types of bridges, doing outreach to stakeholders in the academia, in the private sector, and in the public generally, to build the kind of consensus that is required to navigate the complexities around foreign interference. I would also just say that I used this speech, which I gave to CG, as an opportunity to talk about the importance of transparency and how, in the eyes of our government, we raise the bar of transparency through the creation of INSERA. We raise the bar of transparency and accountability through the creation of NCCOP. This is the Committee of Parliamentarians that is made up of representation from all of the major sitting parties, including representatives from the Senate, to take a look at some of the hard issues around national security and foreign interference. How I was quite pleased to see that the CSIS director and CSIS generally was doing more public speaking, engaging the public directly on conversations, tough conversations, and how we were seeing more public annual reporting about how we were reducing the threat of foreign interference, including through the work of protective briefings or defensive briefings directly to parliamentarians. I take a moment to expand on this because even as we want to be transparent and shine a light on all this work, it's also important that we understand why there are rules in place to protect classified information. And the answer is very simple, but is sometimes forgotten in the public discourse. If we are careless, if we are reckless about giving out information which is highly classified, then people will die. Confidential informants who have been cultivated by CSIS and our allies who are out in the field as we speak, who put their life in harm's way to protect our democracy, to protect us, will die. The alliances that we have formed, particularly in the post-Second World War era with our Five Eyes partners, especially, and that is work that I also did as Public Safety Minister, those alliances will shatter. Our alliances depend on trust. And they trust us with the most sacred and sensitive information that we share with each other. So yes, we need to be transparent with Canadians about how we do this work, but we must also be very careful to protect the most classified and sensitive information, to protect Canadians, to protect our democracy, and to protect the alliances that underpin all that.
Thank you. Madam Commissioner, those are my questions.
Thank you.